but then somehow you guys got signed to Levelman, right? And now you can actually buy this yeast commercially.
Right. So how did we get from this yeast, which we call GY7B, to the commercial product Philly Sour?
Yeah.
So it was GY7B because we isolated it off a dogwood tree in a graveyard. GY.
Hell yeah.
And it was strain number 7, and there happened to be 2 that we isolated, an A and a B. So GY7B was the winner.
Welcome back to the Brew That Podcast. I'm your host, Richie Tevlin, joined again by
Dave Argust.
Dave Argust. So second time tonight. Evan couldn't make it tonight, but Dave Argust from Beer Mill Westchester. And tonight we have on Matt Farber from Rowan University. Welcome.
Cheers,
so
thank you.
We are huge proponents of formal brewing education here. I think it's vital to every brewer to kind of, even if you have 10 years of experience, to actually go in and kind of like realize why you're doing some things. I think people just kind of get stuck in their ways. And I can't name another beer educator in Philadelphia. I feel like you are the man leading the charge around here. And, you've obviously done other things like the Philly Sour yeast. We'll get into that. But you are the man to meet for, learning how to brew in Philadelphia. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you kindly. Thank you for those words. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yep, and congratulations on Rowan. I know for many years you were kind of the face of U Sciences, so I want to we'll start from the beginning, but, Rowan obviously starting up new, and I guess, is this your first semester?
I've been there for 2 years now, but we've just soft launched our new Brewing Science Certificate program. Yeah,
Awesome.
So we're in our second semester, and we'll really start trying to push some marketing now. So
cool.
This can be the formal debut for the Brewing Science Certificate program at Rowan University.
Fun. So I guess let's start from the beginning. So you were not always an expert PhD brewer, I guess. So you started off at Seton Hall. Can we just start there and kind of how did you get into beer?
I got a Gen Bio degree in general biology at Seton Hall University. I was on the swim team, which is part of why I ended up at Seton Hall. So that started my familiarity with the state of New Jersey. But I was Pennsylvania born and raised. I had an opportunity then in graduate school to go to Pitt. So I went to the University of Pittsburgh, where I got a PhD in molecular biology. That's when I started to dabble in beer as a home brewer. But then a lot of my friends were informal beer nerds. Like we had freezers of yeast before I really knew how to make beer. I knew how to freeze yeast.
That's so funny. It's like normally that's like level 10 of home brewing. Like that's where you guys started out.
Yeah, and I'll never forget, we used to have Friday socials, and we the chair of our department made beer and would bring beer in. So we'd have like nice little homebrew kind of craft beer sessions within the department, and that was in the mid 2000s. So it was nice to be kind of as a consumer in Pittsburgh as craft beer was really starting to get very popular.
Definitely. So I have a question. I don't know much about the Pittsburgh beer scene. I've been there 3 or 4 times. I don't remember much, but I've heard that the Pittsburgh beer scene is very. I guess there's a lot of smaller beer distributors there. Is that the case?
I don't know as much about the beer distribution side, but from the brewery side, East End Brewing Company was the brewery that I
was going to say now it's like popping. Like the Pittsburgh beer scene is, I'd say one of the top in the area. You got Brew Gentleman, Dancing Gnome, Hitchhiker, Vanish, or I always want to say Vanish, but there's another one that's down there that like there's some really, really good beer right now in Pittsburgh that I think it's pretty exciting. Probably not what you had when you were there, but as of recent, like they're putting out some really good Pennsylvania beer right now.
Philadelphia's a beer drinking town. Pittsburgh is a beer drinking town.
Well, and there's an entrepreneur that's come into the Iron City brand and has built a big, beautiful brewery to rep that brand.
Yeah.
And it is gorgeous facility. Yeah. So they're doing some good things there too.
Nice. Yeah, big fan of Icy Light, Icy Lime.
Especially when I'm in Pittsburgh, like that is a go-to beer for me. Like I love seeing it. If I'm here, if I'm like in like this area in Philadelphia area, I'm like, yeah, I'm okay on that. But that's actually what the Philadelphia area needs. We need an Icy Light.
We do.
Yeah. So this was East End Brewing Company. There was where I used to go, and this was before you could sell beer across a bar as a brewery, and so. they used to have a keg out front that was green on one side or red on the other, and you knew they were open based on the color of the keg that was open.
That's funny.
And you had to go in, and you could only buy beer by the growler. That was it. So you'd go in and you get to taste all the different beers, and then leave with a couple growlers, and that was it. That was all you could do. So it's been fun to see everything change over the years.
Definitely. Thank God we are not using growlers anymore.
I still love the growler.
You like 'em?
I love glass. I love kind of the reusability of them.
Where are you getting growlers from?
I still have a dozen in my basement.
Are you
Yeah.
just like filling them up like with like homebrew stuff, or are you going to breweries and
Yeah,
filling
all the
them?
above.
Yeah.
I'll fill them. I just filled some at 2SP
Nice.
for an Eagles game a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
I'll fill them up from the lab. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. So yeah, I try to reuse them. That's why I like the reusability of them still.
Nice. So you were dabbling into homebrew. You
So-
had your PhD.
Yeah, we got detracted there. So I was a self-taught brewer. I started out, my origin story is much like many others. I learned how to homebrew with a Mr. Beer kit that I think I bought off of Woot.com. So Woot.com I think is now owned by Amazon, but at the time I got like a $20 plastic, keg to ferment really old extract and really old hops, and made the most awful beer you've ever tasted and dumped it down the drain. But that was the itch to learn more. Read a lot, met a lot of folks in the industry, worked a lot with the folks at Pitt, who were my scientific colleagues who knew a thing or two about yeast especially. And when I finally graduated and got a job at the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia, it was not yet in beer. It was in biotechnology. So I was teaching a graduate course in biotechnology and doing research in biotechnology that I really could apply to a lot of different fields. We had designed a way of measuring something called proteases. These are enzymes that break down proteins. And so I could build, if I knew the target of a protease, I could build a sensor that we could use to measure that protease activity. And I'll never forget, it's in George Fick's book, Principles of Brewing Science. There was like one sentence that said how yeast can secrete this protease that's detrimental for beer foam quality. And I was like, I wonder what that protease is and if I could build a biosensor for it. So I started researching it, found out some more information about it. We built a sensor to do it, and I took to my boss some data with my homebrew as the input, where we could actually measure the protease that was getting secreted by the yeast into the beer. So I started to present that. I first presented it in a poster, actually at the American it was at Craft Brewers Conference. No, it was at the American Homebrewers Association meeting. It was in Philadelphia in maybe 2011, 2012.
Were they like, we're homebrewers, like, what do we care about protein?
There was a time for the American Homebrewers Association that they were really trying to promote education and research. And in fact, they actually had a research fund where, as a homebrewer, you could apply for a $500 grant to do some type of research that you would then publish in their magazine.
That's cool.
And so they opened the door for people to give posters on their homebrew or whatever they were dabbling in homebrew. So here I show up with this very scientific poster at an American Homebrewers Association meeting. But I made two really important connections at that meeting. Roger Barth, who was a professor of chemistry at Westchester University, who would go on to become my co-author for one of our textbooks called Mastering Brewing Science. And then Bob Hansen, who was the technical director for Brew Malting Company. He was like, this is a really good technical poster. Have you ever considered presenting this at a formal industry meeting like the Master Brewers? I said no. I looked it up. The next meeting was in Austin, Texas, so I went to the Master Brewers Association meeting in Austin, Texas, I think in 2012, and that kind of opened my eyes to how there was formal training and education for brewing. This was 2012. Amidst the early point of the explosive growth of beer.
It's not to cut you off. There's Austin, Texas. Is Shiner Bach in Austin?
I don't know if they're in Austin. I definitely didn't make it there.
Okay. All right. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but no, that's okay. And so it kind of became a conversation with my boss at the time. It's like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And it was like, well, I would do beer and brewing and go into the education and research side of it if there was a job. But there's not a lot of academic positions like that. So he said, what would it do want? And what would it take for us to do that? So we created the first Brewing Science certificate program in the Mid-Atlantic. So by the time we launched, a couple years later, we were the first formal training program in the entire Mid-Atlantic. The American Brewers Guild was in place up in Vermont. I think Appalachian State maybe had just launched a program, but there wasn't anything else. So we launched in 2015, I think.
And you guys were in person. I did the American Brewers Guild, but that was mostly online and then like 2 weeks in person. It was a kind of a almost closer to a college experience.
Yeah, there was a lot of intentional design with the way we put the certificate together. A lot of my background was in teaching and education as well as the science. Yeah. And so I wanted it to be in person. I wanted it to be hands-on skills. There were already some online programs available. ABG had some, Siebel had some. Cornell would eventually come up with one. And to me, I can't teach skills online. I wanted students to be brewing with their hands and building that network, which would lead to success. And so we had a pilot lab that we then installed at the University of Sciences. We were a licensed brewery at one point in time by the state Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That is interesting because who owns a university? Yeah. Who goes on that license?
Were you guys selling beer?
We weren't. So we had an affidavit in place that we would not sell. And so we had some special restrictions then that were put on us. But the board of trustees, there were like 6 or 8 people, were the technical license holders of the brewery.
That's awesome.
It ended up being a little too restrictive, and we kind of let it lapse and just leaned into homebrew laws so that as long as one person was not brewing more than 200 gallons per year, we were fine.
Do you have to be 21 to take the course, or?
It just so happened the way we designed it at the time, and of course this program doesn't exist anymore, but we can get to that. But it was a graduate certificate.
Okay,
So naturally, all of my students were 21, and in fact, I had.
If you have a bachelor's degree and you're getting a graduate degree, you're probably not going into beer. Like if you're younger than 21.
I mean, and 21-year-old and less, they really don't understand and appreciate beer yet. So there was also intent with the way I designed it because the majority of our students were working professionals looking to get into the industry. And I'll talk a little bit later about what we're doing now at Rowan University. We're trying to target a little bit more of those folks already in the industry, looking to kind of build their skill set, get more experience, making it a little more flexible.
So how did, you decided you were doing this, they kind of gave you the lead, like, you can take this and build it. Like, how does building an entire college program work? I mean, you're not just figuring out, like, one class to teach. Like, you're building an entire certificate program.
Yeah, I've done it twice now. So the first time when we did it at University of Sciences, I did it intently with industry. So we worked very closely with an advisory board as well as a lot of other folks that we talked to about how we should do it right. And we heard from a lot of industry veterans in Philadelphia that if they had a position opening for a brewer, it still would take them months to fill it, not because of a lack of interest, but because of a lack of trained folks who could come in and do the job. And I also heard that some of these more online-based programs still weren't teaching skills. They might hire somebody who had some of those credentials, but they really just came in with a slip of paper. They still never really ever touched a tri-clamp, for example.
No, it was the American Brewers Guild. It was really helpful for me because I was already working at a brewery while I did it. But it was mostly like I've never taken a biology course or a chemistry course. So it was like a biology course focused on brewing, chemistry course focused on brewing, an engineering course focused on brewing. But it wasn't like they taught you again, like it's a craft. Like learning how to put a tri-clamp on correctly does matter when you're making beer.
Yeah, and so I approached this very intently. It's what's the industry need, and we made sure we talked to industry about that. It's having some basic science to support the industry because it is a scientific process, right? So understanding some of the basics will kind of help you troubleshoot problems. Certainly 10 years of experience in the industry will do that too, but for trying to get a job more quickly, that'll really help. And then the third is a bigger focus on quality. So we had 2 labs. We had a quality control lab. We had a microbiology beer lab. And then we had our functional pilot breweries that students were working in, ultimately leading to an internship. Now, Richie, I think you had an intern many years ago.
I did. Mark, he was like 40 years old. He had no intention of actually getting into the industry. He just was very interested in it. He now works at the Black Sheep or he was working there. He
Yeah.
still works there.
Yeah, loves bartending.
Yes.
He didn't make the leap, but he wanted to, I think, build up his understanding of process so he could be
It definitely
even
makes you
better.
talk it better, like be able to shoot the
he
shit.
was awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Talk the talk.
Yeah. So that we trained about over 100 students, placed them in internships, and anybody who wanted a job found a job.
Yeah.
And University of Science was acquired by St. Joseph's University in 2020-ish, give or take a year. And the short of it is my workload went up, my pay went down because of some differences in summer funding, and I had an opportunity to go to Rowan University and start a program there.
So before we switch over, because I feel like you're missing a lot of things. It's like you created the lab where you guys were testing beer from other people, right?
Sure.
And then also you guys made the Philly sour yeast when you were there, right?
Yep.
So which one kind of came first? Was the Philly sour yeast just like kind of part of your program, and you?
Yeah. Let me back up. So as a research faculty, not only was I teaching a lot of these courses and helping students find jobs, but I also ran a research lab.
Okay.
And then as part of the expectations for being a research faculty is to find grant money and bring in additional revenue that way while funding scientific services or research. And so one of the things, grants that we were able to receive was from the Pennsylvania Malt and Beverage Promotion Board.
Yep.
To create a quality control lab. So it was a malt beverage analysis lab. So we did contract quality testing for the industry. I ended up hiring a former student, Dan Nooner, who was running quality at 2SP at the time. As part of his internship, he built their lab. Wow. And then they hired him to run it. And so then he was a really great fit to come in and help us build our lab and provide those services for the industry. So we were doing fairly well, and then COVID happened. Then a lot of transitions happened with St. Joe's, and we ultimately had to kind of shut things down.
So what was that? People would take like smaller brewers that didn't have labs would then come and take their beer there, and you analyze
exactly.
it, IBUs, whatever else you needed to test.
Yep, and so it was case to case dependent. I mean, we did a lot of micro analysis.
Okay.
We did a lot of nutrition label analysis, like calorie content.
And breweries were asking for the calorie content? Because that's like a hot topic.
Was it for not beer though? Like I think seltzers.
Yep,
Seltzers.
it was
need
seltzers.
Okay.
It was
Yeah,
low alcohol
calories on
beers. I'm sure we would have gotten a lot of business with Nablau's with no low alcohol, but that hadn't yet.
Those
driven.
need like really, really specific testing for them, don't they?
There
Like, I have no idea. That's not my game, but I know they need like really, really strong. Just because like if it's gonna be non-alc, it has to be non-alc. It can't be up to 1%. It's got to be below 0.5.
Yeah, I would say there's three things. Probably the first is that a validation of the alcohol content. The second is an estimation of or measurement of the calories, because a lot of times that's useful data for the label. A lot of the calories in beer is actually from alcohol. So just by simply having a low or no alcohol beer, you're getting a less caloric beverage to begin with.
Like, do you know what would athletic brewing be like? How many?
They're about 100 calories,
Okay.
or like 120, I think. There's ones that are lower though. Like Partake is in like the 30 to 40, but they lack flavor.
Yep.
That's just where like from the ones that I've tried, the ones that are higher calorie, they just have more flavor. Some of them are even using lactose now, just to give it like more of like a fuller body.
Got it.
Which is super interesting to me. Like a lot of people now, like they see lactose and they're like, oh, I don't want that beer. But to me, if I see lactose in a non-alc beer, I kind of want it because I know it's going to taste closer to something that I'm more used to.
Definitely.
Yeah, one of my concerns always with lactose is when brewers aren't putting it on the label. So many have been getting more responsible with that, but especially when that was kind of rising to prominence in the 2010s, maybe a lot of people were making pastry stouts, right, and dessert beers, and not really talking about how they were putting this thing that some people might actually not respond well to. So I'm glad that people are coming around to labeling it.
I think just getting ABVs on beers, like to me, like I look at beers in my store and I'm like, where's the ABV on this? I have to go straight to Untapped that's the only way I could find out what literally the ABV is.
It is kind of crazy. Like you legally don't need to put the ABV on, which blows my mind. Like, who would buy a product that you have no idea how drunk you're?
Yeah, if it doesn't go across state lines, you don't need to label it.
That's crazy. It's also like you said, the lactose thing. It was like I think people have gotten on off the lactose train, but nobody said that there was lactose in it. But like, so many people are lactose intolerant. So like, is this gonna bother you? We're just dumping bags of lactose into the beer.
I had a customer return it because he was vegan, and I was like, I didn't even cross my mind.
Yeah.
I was just like, my bad, man. I'll take it back from you then. I mean, I recommended it to him too. Yeah. I was like, oh, here you go, man. And he came back and he's like, oh, dude, I'm vegan. And I'm like, oh, I guess you can't drink it. I'll take it back.
That was a big thing with there was a food blogger who was calling out Guinness for not being vegan anymore because they were using isinglass as a fining. So isinglass was derived from
fish liver or
fish swim bladder. Yeah. And it's used as a fining agent.
Yeah.
And in theory, it shouldn't be in the finished beer because by nature, it's removing solids and it too will be removed. But an animal product was used. So
I think Coors Light, I think Miller Lite also used asbestos filters for like 60 years. And no asbestos got through, and it was actually the best filtering agent, but it is crazy to think that you were using asbestos to flow all your beer through to filter it out.
I've never heard that. That's insane.
Yeah. So the lab was happening, and I guess kind of all of that stuff kind of came to a screeching halt.
Yeah. So we pick it up again when the time's right. But it kind of with my transition to a new institution, there wasn't really anybody to keep it going. So everything kind of slowed down with COVID.
Yeah.
And so then my research lab was running this whole time too. And one of the major findings that we developed out of my lab was Philly Sour. And so Philly Sour is a special yeast that does both lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation. Most yeast that we know, ale yeast, lager yeast, right, make alcohol from sugar. And it's the bacteria that we knew of that made lactic acid bacteria, Pediococcus, and other LABs. And so when you think of like sauerkraut, yogurt, those are often fermented with bacteria that drive that acid production. And we were really excited when we found this yeast that made both acid and alcohol. And I should set up how we found it. I engaged a lot of students in research by asking them to go out and find wild yeast. There are yeast everywhere. We're sitting in a pretty sterile room, but I guarantee you we could find lots of yeast here, not only on our bodies, but just on the walls and the dust. Of course, there's beers on our table, but there's an estimate that there's somewhere between 200 and 400,000 species of yeast, but only 2 to 4% have actually been identified and characterized. And so it was 2% when I first started doing this back in 2012-ish, and now it's maybe 3 to 4%. So we haven't discovered much more since in 10 years. And so we go out into the world, we sample trees. Tree bark is a really good source of yeast for reasons I can get into if we care to talk about.
Let's get into it. I mean, we're not going to get into it anybody else. So.
Sure, yeah. So, when I say where do you think yeast might be, what would you think?
I mean, on organic matter that it can eat, but like as simple sugar as it can get.
Yeah. So sugar. So those are certainly good sources. So like if you can find sap on a tree, like that's really good. Fruits only if they're bruised, right? Because a fruit generally has a waxy substrate that prevents microbes from eating its sugar, right? It's not ready. But if you can find it fallen and bruised, that can be really good. But honestly, tree bark is one of the best locations for hunting yeast, as is like leaf litter. Because when you think about leaves, I love the carbon life cycle of biology. And then when trees drop their leaves, right, when the springtime comes, those leaves are gone, right? And so the microbes that are in the world are breaking down those leaves for energy during the downtime until spring. And so there's a kind of a rise in the microbial flora in the fall, especially for those reasons. But tree bark, there's a lot of yeast that can utilize those sugars.
Lambic beer, it's obviously like you need to brew it in the fall because it's like cooler temperatures. But does that have anything to do with it? Because there's just more wild yeast in the fall, so like when they open it up, like you're able to kind of get that's naturally being created.
There's some really great scientific papers. If anyone's listening that wants to go down a research rabbit hole, if you can find there's one paper that looks at the microbial profile of American coolship that came out of Allagash, because we can't call it lambic in the U.S. And then there's another paper from a different group that studied actual lambic production, and they took samples throughout the entirety of production. So you're making wort, you're cooling it in a big, large, shallow coolship, letting it naturally come to room temp, and in that process, you're creating steam, which is rising, collecting in the rafters, which are wood.
Yeah.
So there's probably some microbes in the rafters within the brewery itself, but then also there's inoculation by dust that's coming through the air, through the windows. And so the reason for the timing is because ideally that's when there are the most microbes on the wind for colonizing and inoculating the wort as it's naturally cooling in the coolship. That's not to say that there aren't yeast around in the winter or in the summer. I mean, I would assume there are some yeasts that are more tolerant to the cold or the hot, and I think there's some interesting things to be said there. But the abundance, the most are going to be found in the fall and spring in those periods of lambic production. And so just to finish that story, right? So then after that wort gets cooled, it sometimes goes into stainless for a little bit until ultimately it goes into wooden barrels, where there would be a whole new round of microbes. And so it's interesting to look at the change and the way that different microbes populate the time from 0 to 2 years or 3 years, and how it shifts both the bacteria and the yeast. And that is why lambic or American coolship ale is so beautifully complex, because of the microbial profile that changes is so complex. And you will get much different flavors, profiles, characters, but it's also, I won't say uncontrollable, right? But it's very difficult to make the exact same thing ever and again, right? And that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
Whereas my approach with trying to isolate wild yeast is to put a little bit of control back into it. If we can identify and isolate the strains, tapping the table, sorry for that. If we can identify the strains and isolate them, then we can brew with a little bit more consistency and control. And so selfishly, I'm trying to isolate interesting fermenters. For my students, I'm just trying to get them to understand aseptic technique and how to cultivate yeast in the laboratory. And learn some of those techniques. And it just so happened in one of our cultivations, so we'll pull a sample of bark, for example, and we'll put it into wort. So we're not going to take wort outside and just sit it out there. We're going to bring the samples into the lab and put it into wort and allow it to ferment there. We're asking...
That's almost more control, because you're exposing to everything, but you can isolate it to just this piece of bark.
Yeah, and I've been doing this for over 10 years. We've tried a lot of different things. We've tried taking swabs and swabbing things and putting the swabs in there. We've tried direct plating on plates and isolating colonies and then trying to ferment with those. But we've had the most success with just taking a piece of bark and putting it into some wort and seeing what ferments. And then we'll take that and we'll isolate the yeast that are successful there.
Is it yeast that's coming off it mostly, or is it like pediococcus, like bacteria? Like what are the things they're seeing most come off of that?
We try to control for not isolating bacteria.
Okay.
And you can do that from a couple of different ways. You could pre-acidify your wort, which is a common way that a lot of brewers will do it.
Like acid washing.
Add some acid directly to your wort and make sure that it's a pH of 4.5 or less.
Yeah.
There are no pathogens that can grow at that pH. We are actually adding antibiotics to the wort, right? Because we're not tasting or doing anything at this point. We're just evaluating fermentation profile and seeing if we can make some good beer from a process standpoint.
You say, I'm sorry to cut you off again, but like the yeast is like one of the 4 major raw materials. So we've talked about this in the past with like malt and hops, where the flavor is almost the last thing that you need to figure out. Like you need to figure out if it actually works first. So at this point, you're not even determining the flavor of it. Just like, does this do the steps that it needs to do to be like an actual product.
Correct. So we're just using malt extract to make like a 10% or 10-degree Plato wort.
Yeah.
And we'll sometimes hop it, but we don't really care too much about the hops. The hops can be useful to be antimicrobial. And then we're just seeing if it can ferment. So there's two things that are really important for us to measure. We're measuring the density or the gravity. We're seeing, is it reducing the sugar content so that it's actually making alcohol? And then we will also measure the pH. So the pH is really important. We are not pre-acidifying our wort because I want to make sure that this yeast is acidifying it enough to be food safe.
Yeah.
Again, that mark of being a pH of 4.5 is really important. Wort before fermentation is probably around 5.5. And so we'll get some yeast that might do a little bit of fermentation and it won't acidify it at all. And so I don't care. I don't want that yeast. It's not food safe. And so in this course of this particular time when we went out in the field and we're doing this, I'm measuring the pH, and it was a pH of like 3.2, which is sour. That's in the pretty sour beer territory, to which I thought it was a mistake. I thought maybe it was contaminated with the bacteria that was making acid.
All right, who's going to see?
And so we did it again, and it was still sour. We isolated the yeast, and it was still making sour. We eventually identified it. It was a yeast called Leschantia thermotolerans. Learned that the wine industry had been using it for a little bit for bioacid production, but no one had yet really been driving it in the brewing industry. And that's kind of how we got it found.
Okay, but that's only, to me, that's like the beginning of the story. Like, scientists in a lab figuring stuff out. I feel like, I don't know anything about science, but I feel like that happens all the time. But then somehow you guys got signed to Lowland, right? And now you can actually buy this yeast commercially.
Right. So how did we get from this yeast, which we call GY7B, to the commercial product Philly Sour?
Yeah.
So it was GY7B because we isolated it off a dogwood tree in a graveyard. GY.
Hell yeah.
And it was strain number 7, and there happened to be 2 that we isolated, an A and a B. So GY7B was the winner. And the university owns all of my intellectual property. All right. So I have to disclose work that could be commercially viable. I had been talking to people about this yeast, and our intellectual property office said this sounds like something we should try to pursue. So you file a provisional patent pretty easily, and it's relatively inexpensive. We're talking a couple grand, but when the whole process is a lot more than that. But that gives you like a year to actually then start talking about it. So we kind of took the data, took a manuscript, and sent it to the attorneys that the university worked with, and they rewrote it into what is called this provisional patent, which we could submit pretty quickly. That then gave us the opportunity to start talking to potential commercial partners. We talked to a lot of people. We talked to breweries, we talked to yeast companies, and long story short, it was Lallemand, who's a national yeast provider in active dry yeast especially. And they were very interested in it. They took it and did their own R&D on it, which I wasn't a part of for a long time until they pulled us back in and said, this is something we're really interested in. And then our Office of Sponsored Research then worked with their team to figure out what that kind of deal would look like while we continued to pursue the patent kind of on our end. So University of Sciences, now St. Joseph's University, owns that patent, which was eventually issued. And then Lallemand has licensed it. And so,
did you get to name it Philly Sour Yeast?
It was a team effort. It was a name that was pitched by Lallemand. I said, that's it. It's such a great name.
It says Philly Sour. You know, the fact that you're, I mean, it is sold. Yeah, I've used it commercially. Yeah. You said Levante has used it.
Yep.
It's cool that like you're creating something, and it's like it's not just like the new English ale yeast. This is something that's like just totally different, and it does. You don't need to kettle sour it. You don't need to throw microbes in it. It makes a beer and acidifies it at the same time. It's crazy.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, I have goosebumps still thinking about this, right? Because, I mean, I've been working with this thing for more than 10 years.
Yeah.
And to name it Philly Sour, like I said, I'm Pennsylvania born and raised, though now trying my best to help New Jersey beer, which we can get into. Not that they need help, but just that that's now where I am. But it's great to give Philly some love. Of course, I'm repping my Eagles hat today for those who are watching.
Is there a favorite beer that came out of the Philly Sour that you have right now? Or?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I would say one of my favorites came out of Triple Bottom Brewing Company. They used it for one of their anniversary ales. And I can't remember the name, but it had something to do with lightning because while it was fermenting, their building was hit with lightning and it fried their generator, and the fermenter got, I think, pretty hot. And they ended up finishing it with a Saison strain, which I also love doing. Because you can get kind of a controlled, rapid lambic, not with the complexity and the beauty of a traditional lambic, but you still get some really nice acid profile.
Very cool yeast.
Philly Sour has some flavor character to it. You're going to get some of the phenols from the Saison, and it was a really nice sour Saison that they made with Philly Sour. It was also,
what I remembered about it was, like when you use some hops, like they taste very fruity. It tastes like almost like there's sometimes fruit in the beer sometimes with like these IPAs. And I remember, like if you drop the pH, like, you know, fruit is both sweet and it's sour. So like to get a true fruit flavor, you need a lower pH. And this gave it like this fruit punch, like it tasted like a fruit. It was like much more fruit tasting than a normal IPA. It wasn't that it was super sour. It was just like a much better, crisper tasting fruit flavor.
Yeah, the really nice thing about using a lactic acid yeast, and Philly Sour is now not the only one that's out there, but it gives you a little bit of control in how much acid you're making. And some brewers don't maybe fully understand that when they're working with it, and they're like, oh, it's not that sour. And there's a couple different things you can do to drive that. Pitch rate is really important. Temperature is really important. It likes a hot ferment. So when that lightning knocked out that glycol, it was actually good that it fermented hot, and it did well there. And then it loves simple sugar. So you add Dex or you add glucose or increase the simple sugars in your mash, you're going to drive even more acid. And so I've had very subtle sours that are made with Philly Sour, and then I've had enamel stripping sours with Philly Sour. And so it's a really interesting tool to use for brewers. And to your point about fruit and driving fruit, when you think about fruit juices are acidic, right? And so there is a brightness that drives that kind of fruit flavor forward. So a sour beer is going to benefit a fruit addition at some point in the process.
Definitely.
It can also, you can add fruit early in fermentation, and that has simple sugars that'll drive acid as well.
Nice.
And I did bring some if we want to.
Yeah, let me finish this.
If we want to try some. So I brought one is from 0 Day Brewing Company. So my friend Hannah brewed this. It's called Are You Mad at Me? And it has a nice kind of social media conversation where nobody is responding. It's after 678 missed calls. And so this is a boysenberry coconut Berliner Weiss. So Philly Sour
works. You forgot to spell something wrong there. Normally there's some type in that.
Philly Sour works really well as a Berliner Weiss. Not too strong of a beer, kind of soft acid profile with some fruit. And I really like this style and this beer in particular because I think it's very well balanced. The boysenberry is subtle but present. The coconut is subtle but present.
Also, I want to say thank you for bringing in some Nugget Nectar.
Yeah.
Very fitting.
Yeah, literally one of my favorite beers of the year. I'm going to say between that, I love Sierra Celebration. I don't drink many IPAs anymore, and these two, that and Sierra Celebration, are like two of my favorite beers of the year.
It is the end of January, and it is Nugget Nectar season, and it is also a favorite of mine.
Yeah, this is really good.
And so this is actually getting pretty old. It's at least.
I like the coconut adds like this different layer to that.
Yeah, the coconut is really interesting in it.
It's at least 8 months old, and you still get a little bit of the acidity. Right?
Yeah.
This one isn't one of those enamel stripping, but it's present. You're getting that boysenberry, you're getting that coconut. It's a nice.
This
balance.
is like the type of like sour beer that I like. Like I don't want that like super fruity one. I want something that's a little bit less, like easier to drink.
Some people go too hard with the sour, just too hard with the fruit, and it's just like, this is like 23 Plato. And it's just like, what is this beer?
Calories, just tons of calories.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these are great in the summer too, right? It's just something with the heat, a little bit of acidity, a little bit of fruit goes a long way. Philly sour drops usually pretty clean and clear too, which is nice.
Yeah, I like that.
Beers can be bright. Something we don't fully understand is foam stability. So a lot of Philly sour beers tend to have a pretty decent head, which sour beers don't necessarily. We don't fully understand that yet.
Do you think it has anything to do with the acidity happening during fermentation as opposed to the fermentation? It's like there's normal sour beers. It's like a kettle sour beer that they're happening at separate times. It's like you're either like fermenting the wort after it's already at like 3 9 or 3.8 pH, or you're souring after the fact.
Hard to say. I mean, there's been some studies. I think Carl Siebert out of Cornell did some of these where he just added acid to beer and could show that you lost foam stability by acidifying it. You're really trying to maintain the surface tension of the bubble, right? Yep. And so there's proteins and polyphenols from the hops that kind of help support those bubbles. So that's one way of stabilizing it, is stabilizing that surface tension. You can make the beer more viscous. That also helps to improve drainage or reduce drainage so that foam will stay solid longer. I think this is a little more viscous. We tend to feel on your palate as you're taking a sip of this, it's got some body to it still.
It really does.
And so we've made some quote unquote dry beers, that from a fermentation standpoint are fermenting pretty well, but they still have a pretty good body to them. So it might be that these beers are a little more viscous. It's an interesting question that we just haven't really had the time to pursue. And then there's like a third reason. Another thing I think is really interesting about foam is there's some yeast strains that are considered foam positive, right? So they actually are strains themselves perhaps secreting a protein or sloughing off some residue from their outside of their cell surface that promotes the foam.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen in the last couple of years just like really not last year, like an explosion of like people's obsession with foam.
Great. I mean, it's
very cool.
It is way too late, but better late than never. I mean,
wishful thinking. They're crazy about their foam right now. I'm really interested by it.
Yeah, so every couple of years, like there's these there's these great innovations of like hot products or these things like customers don't really see, like they're starting to kind of see like the cryo hops. Like it took a while for kind of like the producers of raw materials to start making products for craft brewers that were marketed themselves that then the craft brewers could promote. But a lot of this stuff is just like there's no way for you to tell the customer this, and then it sounds like too scientific. But there's a lot of hot products that, especially the macro brewers, have been using that like create foam stability. Yep. And I think that might be like a way for lager brewers to kind of like lean into that they're using these advanced hot products that like you're not even like they're not sexy right now, but if they give it a cool name and then people start using them.
Yeah, there's a lot of hot products and processes to promote foam. I mean, we've as brewers have been doing that for a long time, and I think unfortunately it comes down to the culture of the beer drinker, right? Where if you look at European glassware, for example, especially in Belgium, right, there's often a line demarking the volume of the beer, right? And so then everything else is bonus for foam, right? Yeah. And so when you get served a nice foamy pint, there's that line, and you're getting it. In fact, you're actually getting more than, because the foam has beer in it as well. And that doesn't exist in American beer. And so when you're getting a shaker pint, right, you want that shaker pint to be top to the top with beer, because I'm paying $8 for that pint. I want $8 a beer. So, I take that personally in that it's my job as an educator to teach the value of foam. And if it takes milk tubes to do it, then let's do it. Let's go.
Let's rip them.
So I actually have a lecture entirely on foam. It's been an entire lecture on foam.
That's awesome. I feel like that's something that like you could go to like Human Robot or one of these other places like Pushing Foam. Like people would show up. It's almost like like a trivia night. Like people would be interested.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fun. All right, so we haven't even started talking about Rowan. Like, all right, you left U Sciences / St. Joe's, but in I guess 2022, and then you started working on building out, I guess, another one of these programs.
Yeah, so it takes time to kind of get the academics approved through the university system. So that took a year. Kind of we soft launched it last year. We're working on a final kind of partnership that's still a little too early to discuss, but we're going to be partnering with a brewery to essentially put a pilot facility there and have student beer on tap there. So I'll look forward to following up on that in the near future. But we've kind of reduced the credit load. So it's a 12 credit certificate, 4 courses, brewing science and raw materials, yeast management, sensory training, and brewery design and operations. We also have an internship course if students are looking to transition into the industry and kind of need that connection. And we have 1 or 2 other electives that we might offer. But classes meet once a week, Wednesday nights. So we're trying to make it as approachable as possible for anybody to jump in. If you're working, if you have a family, I get it. I do too. And so kind of come to class once a week. Still, I push for in-person classes because I think that face-to-face is really important. It helps me as an instructor get to know my students so I can help them with their career.
And even just like the conversations before or after class, like I think those are important. Like, the questions that they don't ask during class, I feel like those might be more important.
Yep.
Ask what they don't
and
know.
Still the hands-on skills are important, right? So we're still doing some lab-based work. We're still going to be partnering with the brewery to make sure that students can get in and do work during their time. And then finally, information's everywhere today. It's so easy to find information. And so I still think it's important to have that kind of structure of education to help guide, be a guide. Be a shepherd of information and for students in their careers, whether they're in the industry or trying to get into the industry.
And you said before, not that New Jersey needs help, but New Jersey is almost like an unrealized market for craft beer. Like there's been such restrictions on it, and with the help of Eric Orlando, it's starting to get lifted. But there's really so much growth potential for craft breweries in New Jersey. I feel like you're kind of in the perfect location to kind of help these breweries, provide them with educated brewers.
Yeah, I'll plug your episode with Eric Orlando. It's a good way to recap if you're not familiar with New Jersey beer, kind of what some of the restrictions have been there.
Yeah.
And they've only recently been lifted.
And there's still so much room to grow there.
And that is why I think there's still a lot of room to grow there. And so if you look at like Pennsylvania, which has close to 500 breweries, right? New Jersey only has 175 or so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. And that growth has been delayed if you look at kind of the growth over time. And I think it has to do with a lot of those restrictions that were in place. So a lot of potential still in the industry, and especially in New Jersey.
But it's definitely good to start off with, you're putting out educated brewers to then build that industry. So it's going to...
Yeah, absolutely. We're a support service for the industry, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's though the industry has reached a little bit of maturity, right? There are still operating breweries that need trained employees, and there's still turnover, and still breweries that are opening. So.
Yeah, I think the worst thing that can happen is just a brewery filled with brewers that don't know what they're doing, and one, they make bad beer, but then also they just leave this trail of brewers that don't know what they're doing that just go off to other jobs also.
Yeah, and I don't mean to cast shade on a home brewer who kind of takes that pro path, but I have seen people struggle. I've seen people struggle who have been talented home brewers try to scale up and go pro. I mean, yes, the underlying process is similar, but as you know, the equipment, the larger scale processing is different. And so having some formal training, I think, can really help accelerate that process. Again, experience can do it too, but But it's kind of like we'll make a nice connection between education and sour beer production, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of different paths. Philly Sour is one tool for making sour beer. Getting some formal training in brewing is another tool that one can use to get into the industry.
So you've been doing this for a while. You said that you've had advisory boards from, breweries come in and kind of tell you what they need. Have you seen a shift as far as what breweries are looking for or what the standard is for breweries, like kind of entry level or, what breweries are focused on as far as quality assurance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say 6 years ago, a couple years before COVID, it was quality. There definitely was a rise in the need for technicians who could run a lab. And I think the Brewers Association was pushing that too. They hired Neil Witt as a quality ambassador, for example, amongst some other things. And we were in a really good position to do that with the quality-focused curriculum that we had put together. I think as COVID has done with a lot of things, has necessitated change, and now it's more towards packaging. And so I think there's a lot of need for packaging technicians. We also have a packaging design and operations course that's an elective that may not run every year, but with enough interest, we could.
One thing I've noticed is the higher up you get in brewing, like the larger the brewery is, like the more volume you're doing, it's like the people that are in the management positions, it always goes like the smallest breweries are always like, the head person is a person that just knows how to brew. Then it's someone that's like a cellar person. Then the largest breweries are like people that understand packaging much better. It's like the further you get down the production chain, it's like it just becomes more and more important the larger you get.
But I think with COVID that changed everything because you had to put your beer
Definitely.
in a package to get it out the door and sell it. And so everyone was buying small, fixed head fillers in order to get beer out the door. And I used to teach and preach that like you cannot put beer in a package unless you have a lab, right? Like you can't put wild yeast in that beer that's going to explode on the distributor's shelf.
We will not name names, but Cole and I just talked about this today. We've talked about it in the past. We sent pictures. There's a brewery in Philadelphia, and when you look at the glass bottles, we'll get into glass bottles after this. Glass bottles are beautiful, but
Love
one
glass.
of the greatest things about a can is that you can't see into it. When you have glass bottles, you don't think about like it has to be filled the exact same amount every single time. So like there's brewers that are putting out beer and it's just like beer is all over the place. Oh, thank you. But I think especially the hazy IPA, it's like people forgot a lot of stuff as far as clarity, and there was kind of like if you just overload this beer with hops, you're gonna be able to sell it. But with lagers coming back, I think that there's a swing back. There's gonna be a swing back towards you need to know how to do all these technical things to make beer, more, I guess, resilient, more consistent.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, it's a common adage. The best way to judge a brewery is to drink their lager, right?
Yeah.
Drink a Pilsner. There's nothing to hide behind. So, yeah, all well said. And
this is Mudhen?
So this is Mudhen. So Mudhen also does a series of sours with Philly Sour. This one, the series is called Something Sour.
This is my first Mudhen beer. I've been hearing
I've had Wildwood Haze from them, and I thought it was pretty solid.
Yeah. So Tony's their brewer there. He actually came out of Media, Pennsylvania. He was at Sterling Pig for a while, so I knew him when he was there. And now he's doing some good stuff down in Mudhen. But
nice.
I have this has got some age on it, so I was curious to taste it and see how it ages because
I think this
generally
awesome.
I think sour beers as a whole.
Mango and guava tastes really good, and it's like it's not a super heavy fruited sour. Like this is the type of sour I like. Like this is just like really, really solid, crisp tasting. It's good stuff.
I think this is just one of the nice things. Sour beers tend to age well.
Yeah.
And these are unfiltered. So, I mean, there's Philly Sour dead yeast in this beer in theory, and it's still pretty bright. Mine was poured last, so mine's got a little bit of age.
Is there a reason for that? Is the pH protected against certain things? Is like the oxygenation just like is not as affected or something?
Yeah, that's likely one reason for sure. There could be some other antioxidants that we don't know about from the yeast, for example. Some metabolic processes that we don't yet fully understand as well. But certainly the acidity is going to slow down those oxidation reactions too.
This yeast? Are you seeing stuff like? Wow, It's been so long since I've been in production. What's the? Starts with a D.
Diacetyl?
No, the other one, the yeast that takes a while to ferment.
Oh, diastaticus.
No, that's the one that
the other one.
Bad.
The other one, the next one.
Just naming all the things D I can think about in the industry.
I don't know. It doesn't matter. But it's like the yeast, like it changes over time as it like kind of sits in the barrel. What's the yeast that kind of eats everything?
Brett.
Yes, not a D, a B.
Yeah.
That's embarrassing.
No, it has a D version.
Yeah, the whole time.
There is a D version or a D name for it. I'm blanking on it too. No, but you are correct. There is a D version of it.
Okay, but do you think that this Philly sour yeast might have some characteristics of that, where it just kind of like evolves over time?
No. So I mean, we've now been working with this yeast. I've been working with this yeast for 10 years, right? It's been commercially available for 5 years. We have never seen what Brett has done. DeCara, that's what its name is, DeCara. So you were correct.
That wasn't what I was just wrong.
No, it's
the next D.
It is DeCara. It is DeCara, I swear. You were right. Just own it. So it utilizes wood sugar. So we're all the way back to the start of what I was saying, where like bark is a really good source. Like there's a lot of yeasts that can secrete enzymes that break down those wood sugars, which are very different, like xylose, for example.
Yeah.
And so Brett does that because it buries itself in the wood because it can chew on that wood sugar and kind of get into the barrel.
Yeah.
And then it's slow, so it's making some of these other secondary metabolites, some of these other flavors that are pretty unique, like barnyard and horse blanket, kind of over time.
Horse blanket is the funniest.
I love Brett, man. It disappeared, didn't it?
It did. It'll come back.
Good Brett IPA.
I think everything comes back. Like we were talking earlier, it's like bottles are not cool right now. I think they're eventually going to come back.
I think the next
Same thing,
2 years.
like right now, our lagers are hot. 5 years ago, I couldn't sell a lager to save my life. Like it was just nobody wanted them unless it was like a Miller Lite or Coors Light, but like a craft lager, unheard of.
I think heavy stouts are going to come back to like the pastry stouts.
Wheat beers, I think, are going to be a style that comes back. Right now, it's just Allagash. If you're not Allagash white,
like America does everything. It's just like everyone's gluten intolerant, but in like 2 years from now, everyone's gonna be like if you're gluten intolerant, you're an idiot. And it's like, all right, well,
I'm excited for like their 500 milliliter bottle. Like, I think that would be a really cool platform to come back.
Is it time for us to talk about bottles?
Yes, please.
I want to hear it.
I love glass.
I was reaching for it.
I love glass. Yeah. So I have a slide on one of my lectures, cans versus glass. And don't get me wrong, I get the value of cans. Their pros are many. They're lightweight.
Packaging.
So you can put more of them in your warehouse. You can put more of them on a truck.
They don't break.
They don't break when they fall down.
Crowns are like the large crayon of drawing versus the small crayon. Delicateness.
Yeah, you can take them to the beach, but there's just something about a glass, like the heft. Right? It's kind of like listening to a vinyl record. It's like picking up the vinyl.
Yeah.
You have to think about the music. You have to listen to it in order. To me, when it comes to drinking a beer, right, it's more about the beer than just the beer, right? It's about the experience of the beer. It's who you're with. It's where you are. It's the glassware it's in. It's the bottle that it came from.
Yeah.
So I like the heft of it. I like the feel of it. Glass is also chemically inert, right? So there's nothing coming out of this. And
I mean, Coke out of a glass definitely tastes better than Coke out of a can.
Oh, way better. But that's the sugar.
So, there's a polymer liner in these cans that I know is understood well, but I don't understand it well. And so I like the chemical inertness of the glass. I've heard horror stories of people putting sour beers into can liners before they understood that there are different can liners, right?
Yeah.
So there were brewers who didn't yet fully understand they needed to be talking to Ball rather, about what the certain different liners are to make sure that they're having the right ones, and they were dissolving the liner into their sour beers. And so
it would be kind of cool, like canners are like super cheap now. Like, you can just buy like used canners. But I imagine bottlers are dirt cheap right now. Like, nobody's putting stuff in bottles. Like, if you just lean into the bottle and then just say this is what we're doing.
Something that I like to see European breweries do are the swing top bottles too. Those are. I
do not want to be in charge of the lab.
Those are pretty sick though. We get Grolsch or Flensburger. In those bottles, those are sick.
Yeah, of course, the downside is, as you said, they don't break. So it's a major risk factor when it comes to safety in the brewery. Yeah. I mean, if you have a bottling line, then something breaks, you have to shut it all down just to make sure glass shards didn't fall into other glass bottles, right? And there were a lot of glass bottle recalls back in the day because of that exact same thing.
When I used to work at Flying Dog, they used to, when they first opened back in like the early 90s, they used to make glass 40s. So like when a bottle explodes and you're up by the packaging line, like everyone's like, all right, we have to stop for the next 5 minutes to figure this out. They said when the 40s would explode, it sounded like a bomb went off, and everyone's like,
they were doing craft 40s.
Well, they weren't. Like, I mean, it was craft brew making them. I imagine it was just like kind of malt liquor.
Because that's like one of my like crazy ideas. Is I want a craft brewery to do a 40-ounce beer. I think that would be awesome.
I think the same way with like the 500 milliliters, you just need specialized equipment, and it's just more expensive.
Yeah, or you're doing it by hand.
Well, do a lot by hand, and I think a lot of people will buy them. It would be really funny, and I think it would be a really good social media thing. Yeah. So whoever wants to do it, you can take my idea, but do it.
Well, the other downside to glass is, of course, that they can actually explode in your hand too. So one of my other patents is related to diastaticus. We were talking about D words, right? So this is a yeast, Saison yeast often, that can actually secrete an enzyme that helps to break down some of the residual starch that's in a finished beer to create fermentable sugars, and it can re-ferment. So there were a lot of cases before we really understood what this yeast was and what it was doing, which they had a lawsuit for one of the yeast companies that maybe sold them contaminated yeast from their process because they are producing yeast. They probably in the same BSI tank made a Saison yeast that then they made a California ale yeast in right after, and it had a small time of contamination. So then your IPA turned into a hoppy Saison. But I was contacted. I was almost an expert witness for a trial because attorney's client. He had 3 clients who had physical damage from exploding bottles. Wow. I think one was they were all tendon related, like in hands and I think one was in the leg. But I like to live dangerously, I guess, and drink glass. But no, it's. With good process and good quality, you're making sure that that's not going to happen. You're reducing the risk.
Crazy because I remember. I mean, it almost shut. Left Hand Brewery was one of the largest craft breweries in the country, and it almost put them completely out of business. I think they've since been bought, maybe.
Yeah.
But I think it was because of that, which is insane because, it's just they're buying yeast from somebody else. You're expecting it to be perfect, and I guess it's not.
I mean, that's just...
And at that point, I thought we had figured out, like, craft beer now is so much better than it was 10 years ago. But even 10 years ago, it's like it felt like we had known everything at that point. So it's like we figured everything out, and then diastasis just comes, and it's just like, wait, no, we don't understand this at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's ridiculous about American brewing is the innovation is faster than the science, right? And so... Those Saison strains, we knew always that they would create dry beers, right? But we didn't really fully understand the mechanism, and it wasn't until Americans started putting unfiltered beers in all kinds of bottles and cans, right, that these yeasts ended up re-fermenting because...
Is that what it was? The diastatic was kind of like a Saison yeast?
Yeah. Yep. And so if you were making a Saison yeast, or a Saison rather, you would let it get dry. You would let it finish fermenting, and it might still be active in your Saison, but you've finished it. The issue was that little teeny Saison yeast then would contaminate a different beer that didn't finish that dry, and then that small contaminant was able to drive more fermentable sugars and more fermentation. because the beers are unfiltered. There's active yeast in those cans. More beer sitting on shelves warmer for longer, all promoting that fermentation. And then re-fermentation in a closed package, of course. So we talked about alcohol. The other byproduct of fermentation is carbon dioxide. So then you're driving pressure, and eventually it explodes.
So I think this is a nice transition. You brought some bad beer for us. This is fun. You purposely brought bad beer for us. So we've covered it up. We're not going to dump on anybody tonight, but I'm interested.
So this
to see how bad they could actually be.
We have a stout and I've covered it up and I've forgotten. Is it a?
Yeah, we'll find out.
It was a blonde.
Do you
want a stout or a blonde?
I think.
I'd say the blonde.
Yeah, start with the blonde and then do the stout.
I think the stout will hold up.
Should I open it in the bag or?
No, we got paper towels.
The story behind this beer is one of my bottle shop colleagues. One of the distributor was trying to sell him this Belgian style that was a new attempt at nitrogenation. So it's a nitro blonde that I have not seen this brand nitrogenated before, and it apparently didn't go well. I don't know why. I haven't tasted this. We're going to taste it together if I don't get covered.
I don't think it's
going to. Who was it? Well Crafted had
no problem.
Blonde, nitro blonde.
Ooh, a little bit.
There we go.
That's interesting. I'm actually pretty excited about that. You were right. I'm excited that you were right about it.
Way more foam than should be in a nitro beer.
Yeah. Thank you.
I typically don't enjoy
nitro
ugly,
beers. That's ugly foam too. It's like big.
We probably should have got a dump bucket, or I should have poured you a whole lot less.
To me, it doesn't smell bad.
You can smell the age on it. So it
It's
definitely
malty.
has some cardboard.
Yeah.
Cardboard. I taste like kind of cherry, kind of like. Ugh.
It's
not bad.
No, it's just old.
It's just old. Yeah.
There's some floaters.
Definitely some floaters.
This was the blonde.
This was the blonde. It's not good.
It's not good.
I could drink it.
I mean, yes, I would drink this, but
I wouldn't want to drink it, but I could drink it.
That was not as flawed as I thought, as had been described.
I think this one's gonna taste better. Personally, I just have high hopes for it. Kind of looks like cherry Coke coming out.
yeah. Is this nitro?
Yeah.
They were both nitro.
Oh, they're both nitro.
Both of them are nitro.
Right. The other one's opposite nitro.
Yeah.
Bizarro nitro.
This one did give us a nice little pour.
Nice.
Yeah.
Real nice.
Nice little cascade of bubbles for the nitro. So as you're tasting it, so a lot of nitro beers are just dosed with liquid nitrogen, right, at packaging. And nitrogen is less soluble than carbon dioxide, so it doesn't come out of solution as fast.
I don't hate that. I really don't.
No, it's like a little bit flavor or flat. I guess it's
definitely flat and very sweet.
Yeah.
But I don't hate it.
Yeah, there's no like overt off flavors. It's just old and flat.
It's just old.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping to give you some like micro awful like butyric baby vomit sewer drain, but no, we just got old beer. Yeah. That's all right.
I've had some. I did some like flavor tasting when I first got into craft beer, like the butyric acid or like tastes like baby vomit and goat. I'm like, all right, well, is that actually true? I've tasted some beer like that, and it's just like, yeah, that is so gross.
That is terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we do all that in our sensory training class. So we talk not only kind of about how to taste, how to design sensory panels and manage sensory data in the brewery, but then we'll do a lot of those spike trials as well.
So I'm 31 now. When I was younger, I could not taste diacetyl, but your taste buds change, and I'm starting to taste diacetyl a lot more, and it's like just coming across this. In the last couple of months, I've noticed a lot more beers have diacetyl.
Can you explain to the listeners what diacetyl is? Also myself.
So diacetyl, I know I'm going to mess it up. I mean, I forgot what Brett was called. But it's like, it's when beer is not, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's a byproduct of
like
fermentation.
Byproduct.
So.
It's like normally diacetyl gets eaten up after at the like tail end of fermentation gets eaten up, but it's like when it's there, it tastes like butterscotch. And when craft beer first started, it was like
this kind of tastes like butterscotch, right?
a little bit, but it's a stout, so it's like I don't know. Maybe it's supposed to taste like that a little
bit. It's
bit.
fruity. There's a lot of esters in there.
We had some sour beers in this before, but in the last like couple of months, I've like noticed that there's been a lot more butterscotch, toffee notes in IPAs, and I don't think that they're flavor notes that they're designing with the malt. I think that it's actually diacetyl, because diacetyl was such a hot point, 5-10 years ago, and you never even heard about it before. But before it was just like you would determine if an IPA was good or not, or if a brew is good or not, if their IPAs had diacetyl.
Yeah, most yeast make diacetyl to some degree, so it's a byproduct of amino acid synthesis. So when they're trying to make amino acids to build proteins, and there's a couple particular pathways where it chunks out the precursor into the beer, the yeast will be able to, or rather the molecule itself spontaneously turns into diacetyl, and then the yeast can reduce the diacetyl. So the flavor becomes something different that we can't taste as well. So the problem is if you create the precursor and then you remove the yeast, then it spontaneously becomes diacetyl in the package, and you're going to taste that slowly over time.
What's the enzyme that you can add that like
ALDC.
ALDC. That's it.
And so there's an enzyme you can add that kind of cuts out the middleman, cuts out the yeast. So it bypasses diacetyl completely. So it takes that precursor and converts it into the downstream product. So you never get diacetyl.
When you're brewing the beer, the tail end of fermentation, it's starting to wind down. You then have to like ramp up the temperature because the yeast is starting to die off. But then you need to like reactivate them to eat up all the byproducts that they created during fermentation. But then quickly, once they're dead, then crash it and then take them away, because a lot of breweries do this that are just not great breweries. They don't take the yeast off after they've dropped it, and then the yeast dies, and then it creates it tastes like rotting meat. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure on
I
that
don't know. It's like when you don't drop the yeast off of the beer, the dead yeast cells then start to explode, and it's just like it's a dead organism. Like, it tastes like something died in the beer.
Yeah, I get like a lot of astringent bitterness from that. Yeah, but with back to diacetyl, so there's the reason why you're getting it now in a lot of IPAs, especially hazy IPAs, is because of these really late dry hops. It actually reactivates the yeast so that there's more fermentation. And so
it's like from like double dry hopping, triple dry hopping.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of kind of understanding from the academic and research side of the industry and trying to understand why this is happening, specifically with dry hops, because you have what's called hop creep. So essentially when you add these hops, you can actually, if let's say you finish fermentation at 4 degrees Plato, which is just a measure of the sugar, you'll dry hop, and then you'll find that fermentation ticks down to 3, 2.5. Like, it actually reinvigorates the yeast and it dries it out. And so it turns out that there was this paper from like 1890 that described dry hopping, and so the name dry hop comes from the drying effect of hopping. And this was like a good example of research that we forgot about as an industry. And it wasn't until this started happening in packaged beer, when people's beers, their hazy IPAs, were exploding on the marketplace because they dry hopped it a day or two before packaging, put it into a can, put it on a shelf, and then it exploded because it re-fermented because of this dry hop, this drying effect of the re-fermentation. So why that's connected to diacetyl is because it's another round of fermentation. You're getting more diacetyl production in those tail ends. So you sometimes are getting a lot of diacetyl in these hazy IPAs that are late dry hopped.
But ALDC is super expensive. So
yeah, and some yeast companies are now trying to make engineered strains that make it. So there are diacetyl-free strains that pump out ALDC as well. So you could try using those, depending on your opinion of engineered strains.
What's your opinion?
There are a lot of different ways of making engineered strains, some naturally. Like you can force hybridization, for example. Hybridization is essentially sexual reproduction. Sperm meets egg. You can force yeast to form what are called the gametes so that you can push them together and force them to mate and mix their genetic material to create a progeny or an offspring. So there's ways of designing those kinds of yeast. Those are not considered genetically engineered and typically okay to from a federal standpoint. And you can find now hybrids on the market. So if you shop for brewing yeast, for example, you might see some strains listed as a hybrid. Those are not engineered technically. Other strains are taking pieces of DNA and putting it into a yeast. There's cis engineering and there's trans engineering. Cis is like taking a gene from the same yeast. Maybe a brewing strain has a great diacetyl reducing gene, and you could take that and put it into a different strain, right? So that's a similar gene just put into another gene. Whereas a trans would be taking a gene from a mint plant and putting it into yeast. In my opinion, it's all DNA. DNA is DNA is DNA. It's A, T, C, and G. Where it comes from, I mean, it's whether or not you want to do that.
The way you look at beer is like the Matrix, like you're seeing.
A, T, C's, and G's. Yeah. It's all just DNA coming at me.
Yeah.
So I'm not opposed to it. There are ways and times that it has to be regulated, like crops, for example. You don't want an engineered crop to get out of control, but when it comes to brewing yeast,
it's so controlled.
It's so controlled. Yeah, these are. Brewing yeast are the dairy cattle of the brewing industry. They've been bred and domesticated for thousands of years to make beer. So they don't exist in the wild. They're not gonna, if they get released, cause damage.
What do you think? What do you think the next trend is as far as yeast or brewing science?
Great question.
I mean, you're like on the research side, so like I feel like you're kind of seeing beer from a different angle.
All the two conversations right now happening in the Master Brewers Association or the American Society of Brewing Chemists is no and low alcohol beer.
Yep.
And especially safety, because you've reduced alcohol or eliminated alcohol. You've eliminated one of the major barriers to pathogen growth. So that's a big one.
FDA.
Yeah.
That's a big one. Yep. And I would say the other is sustainability. People are trying to think about how they can use less energy or use it more efficiently. And so I think those two topics from an industry perspective are hot ones right now.
Cool. I think we've wrapped it up. So obviously, Rowan, we want to talk about you guys are fully moving on that. But where can we sign up? How does the application process work? How can people listening to this kind of get in on your program?
Yeah, Google Rowan Brewing Science Certificate, and you'll find information on the certificate program. You'll find my email at that webpage, or you can just contact me at farberm@rowan.edu. You can find me on Instagram at Brewing Professor, and reach out to me anytime with any questions about the program. We are literally launching our semester tomorrow.
Let's go.
So I'm teaching 2 classes tomorrow. But then every fall and spring, we're welcoming new students.
Cool.
Nice.
And thank you, Dave, for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks,
Beer
Dave.
Mill WC.
Yep. Yeah, follow Beer Mill WC on Instagram and stop in Westchester if you ever need some beer.
Cool. And you guys still have Nugget Nectar?
Oh, we got plenty of Nugget Nectar right now. I don't know if we'll have some when this releases.
Probably not. It's like going to be a month and a half from now.
Yeah. But maybe, I hope not. I hope we don't have any.
No, it was great. And thank you for bringing that in. Thank you for coming in. Thank you again for coming in tonight. Then you can follow us at Brewdat, at the Brewdat Podcast. And we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Cheers.